Yeah, we can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi Zara.
Hi.
Sharifah
How are you,
here.
Yes, how are you? Where do I share my screen?
Don't worry, I will start. Dear audience, here are two announcements requested that all attendees take note. The first announcement, all audiences are reminded to turn off your microphones throughout the program and you are advised to turn on your front camera. The second announcement, please be informed that there will be a question and answer session with the panel at the end of the webinar. Participants are required to put a question in the chat box. Participants are reminded to fill in the feedback form at the end of the program. Dear participants, please be prepared as the webinar will begin shortly. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera dan salam yang di hatiku. Chief Executive Officer of Corporate Secretaries International Association, CSIA, Mrs. Sarah Kasim, Deputy Dean of Academic Affairs from the Faculty of Administrative Science and Policy Studies, Dr. Zarina Muhammad Zain, Program Advisor, Webinar Corporate Secretaries International Association, CSIA, Faculty of Administrative Science and Policy Studies, Dr. Sharifah Fatihah binti Syed Fuzi, Head of Programs, Program Coordinator. Next, distinguished guests and students from the Faculty of Administrative Science and Policy Studies. Alhamdulillah, as we raise our hands to express our gratitude to God, with His grace and permissions, we can gather today in the webinar Corporate Secretaries International Association, CSIA program. My name is Umi Alis Fitri binti Amran as the moderator for this webinar. Allow me to lead this webinar until the end. On behalf of the program committee, I would like to welcome all the attendees for coming to the program today. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Dr. Sharifah Fatihah Syed Fuzi, Program Advisor of Webinar Corporate Secretaries International Association, CSIA, to give a welcome speech. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, the host, Alice. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good afternoon. Chief Executive Officer of Corporate Secretaries International Association, CSIA, Zara Kasim, Deputy Dean of Academic Affairs from the Faculty of Administrative Science and Policy Study, Dr. Zarina Muhammad Zain, Head of Program Coordinator, distinguished guests, lecturers, students, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Zara for your exceptional presentations today. Okay, your insights and expertise made a significant impact to our webinar. I also want to congratulate and say well done to the organizer, the Corporate Administration Student Society, CAS, for successfully organizing this program, which aims to get a better industry insight into embedding governance, risk and compliance culture in business strategy. Good governance, risk management and compliance practices, or in short form GRC, are essential in strengthening business resilience and trust in organizations. Therefore, the GRC shall not be treated in isolation. It shall also be embedded in formulating corporate strategies. However, establishing an effective GRC model can become a challenge to the business nowadays, especially in the complex business environments. Therefore, I truly appreciate this webinar. We hope it becomes a door of opportunity to enhance our understanding and obtain ideas about integrating GRC into business strategy. Before I end my speech, I would like to applaud the organizing committee for organizing this event. I have noted that you have a rather long and demanding agenda in front of you, and for that reasons, I wouldn't like to keep you any longer than necessary. It is therefore my pleasure to wish you a very fruitful intellectual discourse and to declare that this webinar, Embedding Governance, Risk and Compliance Culture in Business Strategy, is officially open. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharifah Fatihah Syed Fuzi, for the speech. As an introduction to our panel before proceeding to the webinar, Mrs. Zara Kasim joined the professional body sector since November 1999 in the Institute of Public Finance and Auditing, IPFA, as the Professional Development Director. Then in 2005, she appointed as Chief Executive Officer and Group Chief Executive of the Institute and its subsidiary, Public Finance IQ, FIQ, in April 2008. She joined CIMA in 2012, then in February 2017, she started her role as a CEO of CSIA and responsible for coordinating the execution of the strategic goals and plans of the CSIA in driving growth and strategy across the group. Without wasting time, I would like to invite Sarah Kasim, Chief Executive Officer of the International Corporate Secretaries Association, CSIA, to deliver a talk entitled Embedding Governance, Risk and Compliance Culture in Business Strategy. With all due respect, welcome.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. And good afternoon to all of our attendees that has joined us today. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts on the topic of embedding governance, risk and compliance in culture, in business strategy, Over the last decade, CSIA has been building a community of corporate secretaries, governance professionals, and also organizations committed to good governance practices. And we believe that building relationships with the academic community is an integral part of that process. So I would like to acknowledge and thank the management of the University of Technology, FMARA, for providing this opportunity for our organizations to collaborate. The Dean of the Faculty, Associate Professor Dr. Noor Hafiza Mohammed Harith, Dr. Zarina Motzain, Dr. Mazlan Chisol, Dr. Ridwan Yusuf, and the Head of Academic Programs and Program Coordinators. As the next generation of governance leaders, we believe that students are a very critical part of shaping the future of governance, and therefore your voice is a very valued one in the CSIA community. The topic for today is the embedding of governance, risk and compliance, also known as GRC, in business strategy. As corporate secretaries are the custodians of governance in organizations, my presentation will be in the context of the role of the corporate secretary and also in this context. So in that context, allow me to just provide a very brief introduction to CSIA. It was established in 2010 in Geneva, Switzerland, to provide a platform for a unified voice for governance professionals and corporate secretaries. In 2017, we relocated as a company limited by guarantee in Hong Kong. So that is currently where CSIA is resident. The organization consists of an international federation of 12 bodies, and they are professional bodies for corporate secretaries. And we represent more than 100,000 corporate secretaries and governance professionals across 4 continents. And you'll see in the next slide the continents that we are represented at in America, North America, South America, Africa, as well as in Asia. So that is quite a huge community of governance professionals and corporate secretaries. We can have the next slide, please. So the objectives of CSIA is firstly to promote the professional status and recognition of corporate secretaries and governance professionals. There are very many countries where the role of the corporate secretary is still very much perceived as an administrative role. That role has since evolved into a strategic and very trusted advisor to the board. And we will see later on in my presentation as well how that role is constantly evolving and expanding. Our second objective is around providing advocacy for good governance practices. And we do this through research that is being done through CSIA and partners, thought leadership reports, and also promoting best practices. And if you look at our website at csia.org.com, you will find that there are many thought leadership reports, as well as standards that has been developed by countries like Kenya and India, who are also members of CSIA. So there are very good resources that's available from the work that has been done. Then thirdly, we provide a platform where our members and also our stakeholders are able to share good practices, and this comes from their experiences. There are some countries that might be a little bit more advanced in certain areas, and it's important for us to provide that platform where they can learn from each other. So our full members are from 7 countries, Southern Africa, India, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Nigeria, Singapore, and Bangladesh. These members represent the decision makers in our organization, and they are on the council as well as the executive committee. So they really steer the direction of the organization. Our affiliate members are resident in Canada. If we can have the next slide, please. Is in Canada, Kenya, Brazil, the United States, as well as Dubai. They are not part of the decision-making body, but they do support the organization in very many other aspects of the organization. Can you go on to the next slide, please? So today the topic is to get some kind of understanding of what is GRC and how can it be implemented in business strategy. So we're really looking at the why, the what, and the how of GRC. So let's start then perhaps with the why. So why does good governance matter? Why do we have the need for integrating governance, risk, and compliance? These are elements that exist within organizations and have always existed within organizations. So why does it need to be embedded into strategy? Paul Polman, who's the ex-CEO of Unilever, coined the phrase of a VUCA world. And that means a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think you're probably very familiar with that term. So it means we live in a world where global events in the last decade has caused major disruptions in market economies. And it's also threatened the sustainability of organizations to such an extent that very many organizations have not managed to survive because they didn't have the correct structures, governance, procedures, and processes in place to deal with unforeseen events. So as a result of these global events, regulatory requirements, complexity of doing business, the different types of risks that emerged during this period, and also the use of technology has increased exponentially over the last decade. And this was why there was a need for very effective governance leadership across the globe. Now, if we look at these global events and the impact that it's had on governance, we can start off with the pandemic, which I think all of you are very aware of the devastating effects that the pandemic has had on the economy of the world globally. We can have the next slide, please. The pandemic has really highlighted very many weaknesses in governance and also in leadership across the globe. There's been increased pressure and demands on boards as they grapple with the impact of the pandemic. And there's also been more expectations from stakeholders, and this includes your investors, your employees, society, that organizations would act as responsible corporate citizens. And this all happened in an environment where there is radical uncertainty created by these global events. More importantly, it also challenged the shareholder-centric model that organizations or that guided organizations previously. And this means that where organizations were very much focused on profits and shareholders, this has instantly changed. And they became much more aware that they needed to balance the growth and performance of the organization with the needs and expectations of society to ensure that they can meet those needs in an effective and responsible way. For boards, This meant that they also needed to relook and reassess their strategies and relook at their governance models and elevate their governance practices to ensure that while they are looking after the interests of society, they are also aligning that with the objectives and purpose of the organization. So during the period of the pandemic, we found that the role of the corporate secretary expanded beyond that of compliance and governance and actually went into the area of risk. So if we can have the next slide. CSIA and EY Hong Kong collaborated on a project to look at what would be the role of governance professionals and corporate secretaries in a post-pandemic risk environment. Now, this is not a normal role for corporate secretaries, but we found in our findings of this research that this role has become more important. It also highlighted 4 very important areas of change that's happened post-pandemic. The one is around regulatory compliance, and there was a need for a transformation in the traditional risk and compliance functions. So whereas before organizations were more geared towards financial risks, they now needed to take into account any unforeseen risks that may come up in the global economy. So there was a need to transform these functions. Also important was the support for boards in managing these emerging risks. Boards very often do not have all the information. They need to have all the information to make informed decisions. And this means that they need to be supported and informed about emerging risks. Also, GRC technology became quite important, or became quite an important matter that came out of the research. And leveraging that is an important part of managing risk and challenges that come out of these global events. Technological governance, also providing and promoting digital strategies and cybersecurity frameworks to the board. The corporate secretary also becomes the link between technology and governance. And the question often arises, is this the role of the corporate secretary? Is this a governance role? But as this role expands and as risk becomes a very important part of governance, this has become a part of the role of the corporate secretary as well. Stakeholder activism has also increased, and this means that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in a bit more detail, but this also means that it's important for the board to continuously keep up with stakeholder engagement, communicating with stakeholders, and the corporate secretary becomes the bridge between the stakeholders and the board. We can move on to the next slide. In the prior to the pandemic, and this has been on the radar for a very long time, another trigger that has impacted on the governance landscape has been governance scandals and really global failures in governance that has devastated the governance landscape. So I've just cited, for examples of some of the global scandals that's happened over the past few years. The big 4 firms landed in a lot of hot water after they've been found guilty of misstatements and not protecting the public interest, and fines of millions of dollars, pounds, and rands have been, they have had to pay very many fines around not fulfilling their duty in terms of audit. The FTX is a cryptocurrency scandal that has also shed a lot of light on ESG and really had an impact on the whole cryptocurrency industry. The next slide, please. We also have very locally in South Africa, which is the Steinhoff collapse, which was a 200 billion rand collapse and a shareholder value loss of 98%, over a very, very short period, and really devastated investor confidence in the South African economy. And then there was the great Boeing scandal, where there was a loss of lives, a loss of revenue, and definitely no oversight from the board in terms of the safety of passengers. So if we look at the next slide in terms of what went wrong, it's very clear that the issue is around the governance of these organizations. The big four firms' governance structure was structured around partnership governance. So there was actually no board of directors. They had global networks of locally owned partnerships, which means that basically they owned and managed the organizations. So there was no independent directors on their boards. And this obviously is a problem when there is a lack of independence on a board of directors. In the FTX crisis, again, there was no board of directors. And they found that the owner of the cryptocurrency organization, FTX, was actually the only board member. There was no financial controls, no audits, consisted of very many subsidiary companies, which means there was a conflict of interest and self-dealing that took place, and definitely a shocking lack of governance in the structures of this organization. In the case of Boeing, the board of directors did not have the expertise to actually deal with the industry. They did not have any safety experience or knowledge, and their committees were focused on financial risk and not on safety. So there was a complete lack of accountability from the board of directors. If you look at Steinhoff, issue dominant two-tier board structure. So what happens in that instance is you have a management board and you have a supervisory board. And very often the information that has to be passed through to the supervisory board is either the wrong information or a lack of information, which leads to the wrong decisions being taken at the supervisory board level. And this has had a really broad effect and impact on the South African economy largely because there was an erosion of investor confidence in the South African market as a whole. So those are some examples. There are very many more, I'm sure that you are probably aware of from your studies. But these are just 4 examples of where governance really went wrong and where there was a need for effective governance leadership. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So we can see that the theme that has run through all of these corporate scandals was a lack of trust, a lack of accountability and oversight, and a lack of protecting the public interest, which is really the fiduciary duty of a board of directors. Let me move on to the next slide, please. So in his book, Sean Lyons, I thought he actually managed to capture this quite well. His book is called The Corporate Defense and Value Preservation Imperative. And he says in any kind of post-mortem analysis of what are the causes of corporate scandals, very typically what will come out in most of them, and as we've seen also in the examples that I've cited before, it's failures in corporate governance, it's poor risk management, compliance failures, unreliable intelligence, inadequate security, insufficient resilience, ineffective controls, and failures by assurance providers, which is the auditors. So in very many cases, this becomes a systemic issue. And when that happens, it can expand into the industry, as we saw happened with FTX, and it expanded into the cryptocurrency industry, which actually lost 75% of its assets within a very short period of time. And it can also impact on the broader economy, as happened in the case of South Africa with the Steinhoff scandal, and investor confidence was eroded in the South African market. So I think that actually captured really well what the typical reasons are for corporate scandals and governance failures. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, please? Another trigger that also resulted in very big changes in the landscape was climate change. And we've all seen the reports in the news about hurricanes and rising temperatures, rising sea levels, global warming. It is across the globe. Climates have completely changed, and this has had an impact on economies. If we look at the next slide, you will see just some examples of that impact on economies. In Kenya, there has been these erratic weather patterns, and that is devastating floods followed by droughts. And this was prolonged periods of droughts, which had a real impact on the economy. And the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics quoted that the country loses 2 to 2.4% of its GDP annually due to the effects of climate change. If we look at Uganda, a similar situation with droughts and floods, and they looking at a reduction of 4.7% of their GDP as a result of climate change. In Malaysia, and this has been cited as one of the several nations that in rising sea levels, posing a threat to the palm oil production and the rubber production in the country. So the impact of climate change definitely has had a huge impact on economies and therefore necessitated more effective governance leadership. We move on to the next slide. Csia embarked on a project where we looked at the role of the corporate secretary in climate change. And again, this is not a role that normally would be allocated to the corporate secretary or governance professional. But we did find that there are some positive results that came out of the study, that more than half of the respondents did think that there were positive future plans to drive climate change. Organizations had specific target areas where they were looking at climate change initiatives. And many organizations are putting in place mechanisms for climate action. But if you can see from these statistics, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in organizations, a lot of governance structures that need to be put in place. And we'll talk a bit later about the regulations around climate change and climate action, which really will have an impact on governance going forward as well. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? I think technology has probably been one of the biggest disruptors of the economies, with cybersecurity threats and also looking at artificial intelligence. And if you look at the next slide, I think it also sums up very well how that has impacted on governance. As it becomes much more of the disruption in economies, boards need to understand if they are going to be implementing a digitalization strategy, they need to be able to understand how it fits into their strategies and the overall strategy of the organization. There is also an issue of ethics that comes in with artificial intelligence, and also managing expectations. If you're looking internally at your employees, there's culture changes that will need to take place within the organization. There would be employees would feel that AI would be a threat to their jobs. So there's a lot of management of expectations that needs to happen, and boards need to be very aware of how they're going to manage that. Another big issue around artificial intelligence is that there aren't a lot of skills available. Boards very often do not have the skills and the understanding around artificial intelligence. So this also becomes something that is really important for boards to deal with and manage. And it's really important that that becomes a prioritized item on their agendas. We'll move on to the next slide, please. So that brings us to the what. And if we're looking at the elements of GRC, the governance, the risk and compliance, as I've noted before, these elements have always existed. Mostly they have been dealt with in isolation, looking at governance and risk and compliance separately, not holistically within the context of the organization. We go on to the next slide. So I'm sure that you know these definitions, but just for completeness sake, if we look at governance, it's ensuring that the activities of the organization is aligned with the goals of the organization, but also within the risk parameters and compliance needs. This has also become very much aligned with the purpose of the organization, and that purpose needs to be aligned with societal expectations. So there is a lot that the governance aspect needs to cover. When it comes to risk management, this is to ensure that all the risks associated with your business operations is identified and addressed. And that also within the context of supporting the objectives of the organization. The compliance function is about making sure that the regulations that is required is being adhered to. And this has become a lot more complex in recent years. With climate change, with technology, these regulations have increased quite exponentially. So those are the different elements of the GRC. We can move on to the next slide. Can we move to the next slide, please? There are 4 elements and drivers of GRC in organizations, and these have quite an impact on how you integrate the factors, the different subdisciplines of GRC. The first one, and probably the most important one, is regulation. That is a very big driver of change in organizations. It's important for organizations to ensure that they do adhere to all the regulations, and the changes in these regulations are happening on a very regular basis. So it's important that boards are aware of the changes and that they are able to integrate and incorporate that into their strategies. People becomes a very, as you will see throughout the presentation, the people aspect. We look at issues around diversity, and it's not just diversity, but it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, which becomes a very much broader aspect of ensuring that all your stakeholders, all your employees are valued and have a voice in your organization. So it does include your gender diversity, racial diversity, age diversity, but ensuring that everyone feels that they belong within the organization. There is also considering the millennials coming into the job market. Their needs are very different to many of the current employees in an organization, and balancing the needs of millennials, the skills and the requirements they have becomes an important aspect as well. And then there's the issue of skills gaps that do exist, specifically around technology, but also around ESG. There is often skills gaps on boards, but also within organizations that needs to be managed. Technology, as I've mentioned before, becomes another driver for GRC to ensure that it's fully integrated, as well as the processes in the organization needs to be aligned to all of these aspects to ensure full integration. We move on to the next slide. We'll just go into a little bit of detail around some of these drivers. I've just highlighted one aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion because there is a lot more that can be said around this issue. Probably a full webinar can be held around this issue, but we don't have time for that. So I focused more on women empowerment and women on boards. So if you look at the next slide, this is a slide from the OECD Fact Book of 2021. And as you can see, while there has been growth of women on boards, there is still less than a quarter of board members that have women on boards in listed companies globally. What you see here in terms of statistics is mainly Europe and New Zealand. So you will see the statistics there are around women in boards. Directorship has increased from 14.5 to 23.3% by 2020. And in 4 jurisdictions only, there were more than 40% of women on boards. These are not great statistics, and it clearly shows that we still need to do a lot more work. But what is even more concerning is that when it comes to leadership positions and company management, there's a much slower growth of ensuring that women participate in management positions. And this is 30.9 to 33% by 2020 in managerial positions. In terms of CEOs, fewer than 1 in 10 companies in the EU and the US had a female chair or CEO. So clearly there is still a lot of work that needs to be done around the aspect of diversity, gender diversity. If we look at the next slide, the situation in Africa is a little bit better. In a 2015 report, Kenya had the highest percentage in Africa with 19.8%. And as you can see, these percentages are still fairly low, but it did increase in 2017 to 21%. And by 2021, the number had risen to 36%, which is really good if we're looking at a global average of 23.3%. And this is according to the Kenya Institute of Management Statistics. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and this is just gender diversity. If we look at issues around racial diversity as well as age diversity, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done by boards. We move to the next slide, and we look at some of the challenges that boards are faced with. And we touched a little bit on this already, but if we look at regulation, we are existing in a much more complex regulatory environment. So recently, the IFRS Foundation established the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, and in June last year, they released standards S1 and S2. And the importance of these standards is that before the standards were released or the ISSB was established, there was what they called the alphabet soup of organizations and standards. And organizations could choose which ones they wanted to use for sustainability reporting. But however, what was needed was a benchmark. Because of globalization and interconnectedness, we find that there is a need for a global benchmark within economies in order to be able to effectively report on sustainability. So that was quite an important milestone in the area of climate change reporting. With globalization and interconnectedness as well, regulation became more complex because organizations expanded into different countries where different laws existed. So it was important for them to understand all the regulatory requirements. Data privacy laws also increased around the introduction of technology and technological developments. And if you look at technology itself and the existence of cybersecurity threats, which is a very, very real threat in many organizations, that has also become an issue for boards that they need, a challenge for boards that they needed to manage, as well as compliance challenges of increases in data privacy laws, and of course, the introduction of artificial intelligence. And what boards are grappling with in terms of artificial intelligence is, although there are positives around increased efficiency, there are increased revenues, and there are cost savings, there's also a lack of skills at the board level and challenges with ethical and culture changes. We can move on to the next slide. Another challenge is shareholder activism, and this has increased quite exponentially over the last decade as well. In 2013, there were 165 cases of litigation against boards, and that increased or doubled in 2018 to 403. And just to give you 3 examples of cases that's recently been made against boards. Shell is the most recent one in 2022, where they faced legal action for their failure to adequately prepare the company for the Global Net Zero Initiative. So this is a huge case of breach of their fiduciary responsibility. In Boeing's case, they also faced several litigations, and this is around the failure of 2 fatal crashes of their 737 aircraft, in which 346 people lost their life, and they had to pay billions in settlements. And then in FTX case, the founder of the organization was found guilty of 7 counts of fraud and sentenced to 25 years in prison. So while it is obviously good that justice is being served, it is also a very real case of corporate governance failures and the cost of that. We move to the next slide. So the case for integrating these different factors, if we look at the challenges that boards have to face around governance, around risk, and around compliance, is that if we're integrating the strategies and processes in the organization and coordinating all of those functions and capability within and with the required ethical environment, and also ensuring all the risks are addressed and that the organization is in compliance with regulatory requirements, that would be a fully operating integrated system of GRC in an organization. We move on to the next slide. King 4 provides a very good summary of the role of governance in terms of how it needs to be integrated. The board has 4 important functions. It steers and sets direction, it approves policy and planning, oversees and monitors, and ensures accountability. And we've seen in the case of this corporate governance failures that I've mentioned before, how important that role becomes. They're supported by principles and practices, and then the outcomes that we are looking for would be an ethical culture, good performance, effective controls, and legitimacy. And a lot of that did not happen in the corporate governance failures that we looked at before. If we look at the next slide, we're looking at risk management in particular. Why is that important to be integrated? It is important that it's not just isolated silos of risk that exist within organizations. Very many organizations, especially the bigger ones, you will find that different departments have different processes and different sets of information that gets communicated to the board. But if you are establishing an effective risk culture, it means that risk management must permeate throughout the organization, and importantly, must be embedded in daily activities. It is not anything that needs to happen in isolation. It happens all across the organization. Very importantly is the tone from the top. So that means the board and the C-suite, the executives, must fully understand the implications of risks and effective risk management in the organization, and they must set the tone for that to be cascaded into the organization itself. And if we look at what a successful risk culture has, and this is from an article called Enabling Risk Culture Through Governance, Risk and Compliance, there must be common processes across the organization so that there is a process for the information to reach the board level. Efficient interfaces so that the right information reaches the board, easy access to information, and importantly, a holistic view of the risks facing the organization. Very often, in the siloed approaches, you will have different sets of information, and not all of that information always gets to the board. And it's very important for the board to have the right information in order for them to make the right decisions. So that is an important part of risk management. If we move on to the next slide, and we look at compliance, and you'll see very common themes coming through all of these three, which is why it's important to integrate them. Leadership, again, setting the tone from the top. The board is responsible for ensuring that regulatory compliance happens. It's very important that employees also understand what the regulatory compliance requirements are, and that they can embed that into their daily activities. Integrating it into the process and strategy is also a responsibility of the board, and harnessing technology. This is something that will differ in different organizations depending on the size and the capacity of the organization, but it is important. Technology plays a very important role in that. We can move on to the next slide. So I've looked at just two models. There are many different models and approaches to integrating GRC in an organization, but I looked at two models to just share with you today. We look at the first one on the next page, on the next slide. This is the 3 lines model, which has been formed by the European Confederation of Institutes of Internal Auditing and the Federation of European Risk Management Association. And just from these organizations, you can see that this model is very much based on risk management. So the ideology here is that if there is effective risk management and controls in place, that will ensure an effective GRC integration process. So they define 3 lines of responsibility. The first line is around, sorry, can you just go back to the previous slide? The first line is around operational management, and this is where processes are defined and where the risks are then managed at that level. The second line would be around disciplines. So this is where your different disciplines define the procedures and the models. And this is where your quality management sits, your data protection, and the different disciplines within the organization. And then finally, they look at internal audit and the controls and monitoring and oversight, which ensures that this integration process is done effectively. So that's the 3 lines model. If we look at the next model, it is very much based on looking at the integration in a holistic manner. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And it's the GRC capability model. Can you please move to the next slide? The GRC capability model is again focused on looking much more holistically at the integration process and looking at continuous improvement around that. So the 4 components that comprises of is firstly the culture of the organization, understanding your needs of your stakeholders. The second component is then aligning that with the objectives of the organization, and that informs how the processes and business operations are designed. Then looking at performance, identifying where rewards can be given for good performance, as well as where the gaps are and addressing those gaps as soon as possible. And then reviewing that, measuring performance and monitoring to ensure that improvements can be put in place, and where the objectives are not appropriate, that can be replaced. So those are 2 of the models that I just wanted to share with you around how it can be integrated into organizations. We go to the next slide. And just looking at some of the common themes that have come out of the process of integrating GRC. And if you look at the next slide, you will see that there are some common themes, such as ensuring that there is effective governance leadership. The tone from the top is really important when it comes to ensuring that governance, risk, and compliance is fully integrated within an organization. The board needs to be very clear in the guidance that they provide. They need to communicate very clearly with internal and external stakeholders, and they need to ensure that GRC is fully integrated in their strategy as well. The importance of informed decision-making, as I've mentioned before, it's very important that the right information reaches the board to inform the decision-making. And that means that the integration of those different sub-disciplines of governance, risk, and compliance is very important to make sure that that information that reaches the board is the right ones. It's very important for organizations to be agile and resilient because of emerging risks and definite regulatory changes that happens all the time. So they need to be ready to be able to manage those risks and the changes. Your governance strategy is not a static strategy. It needs to be reviewed. Processes and structures needs to be reviewed. And this is probably where the capability model becomes quite important in terms of that regular review that needs to happen. Employee engagement, the people aspect, very important. They need to be involved in every aspect of governance, risk, and compliance, and they need to be aware of the impact of that on the organization. Investment in technology is very often a choice depending on the capacity of the organization, the size of the organization. It can become quite costly, but it is important to make the processes more effective and to save costs in the end, in the long run. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Of these elements. The corporate secretary role has also evolved and expanded. And we found in our research with our EY project that governance professionals are in the best position to support the board. And this is in overseeing the high-risk issues, regulatory management, ESG, as well as technology governance. So those are all the aspects that needs to be integrated in the organization. And it's also important that they drive the awareness of effective governance at the board level. This means prioritizing it on the agenda, that they improve the knowledge base and skill set in order to keep pace of all the changes, and also that they ensure that they drive digital transformation in organizations. If we look at the next slide, we had very similar findings when it came to climate change. Boards do rely on corporate secretaries to drive these initiatives. And the reason for that is that the corporate secretary will make sure that they have the right information and prioritize it on the agenda. They will establish mechanisms to ensure that there is awareness at both board and managerial level. They are also the conduit between the board and stakeholders. Remember that the communication is very important for boards to be able to understand the external environment. And they should also ensure that the board is constantly updated on all the changes that happens on a regulatory basis or compliance basis, as well as technological advancement. I think if we can move to the next slide. Just some examples of companies that has been known to have strong governance, risk, and compliance cultures. Hilton Hotels, very focused on employee development and well-being. Netflix, they prioritize people over process. So they allow their employees freedom to excel, prioritize their well-being. In Microsoft, probably not surprising, they emphasize innovation, diversity, and inclusion. So they actually encourage the employees to take risks and learn from their failures, which is not normally found in any organization that prioritizes profits. So there is a continuous learning and improvement aspect to that. Pixar encourages creative and collaborative culture, so they will encourage the employees to come up with new ideas, and they'll also encourage them to constructively critique those ideas and provide advice. HubSpot is very focused on a transparent and inclusive culture, so they prioritize employee growth, autonomy, and innovation. And Salesforce, again, looks at philanthropy, sustainability, and equality. So they believe in donating their employee time as well as resources to the broader stakeholder community. Can you move to the next slide, please? So I wanted to leave you with a very important question, which is, why is it okay for an ICE company to commit fraud? Because its assets are already frozen. So on that light note, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to look at any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you so much for Mrs. Zahra Kasim for the amazing sharing sessions. To summarize, that it is important actually for the participants to know that there is so many critical aspects of governance, risk management, and compliance (GRC) within the organizations. However, can be overcome with the great leadership, enhanced communication skills, and considered climate change for the corporate secretaries, initiate and foster the stakeholders and engagement. Also strategies in GRC. So we are hoping that all the participants can take an input from the speech to learn, revise, and be applied in our career. Now we will take a few questions for Mrs. Sarah to answer. For the first questions from Nurin Maisara. So the question is, how usually a company will promote risk culture in the company?
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
How usually a company will promoting a risk culture in the company?
Thank you.
That's the question.
Yeah. I think the important part again here to recognize is the role of the board. If the board sets the tone at the top in terms of fully understanding the risk environment in which they operate, and again here we bring in the role of the corporate secretary. The corporate secretary is important not in terms of managing the risk, but in terms of coordinating the risks and bringing to the board those strategic risks that will impact on the strategy of the organization. So the board sets the tone at the top. They will develop the policies around risk management. They will develop the and approve the policies around risk management. And they need to ensure that those policies will cascade down into the rest of the organization. So it's really important for them to understand what environment they are operating in, and then also important to make sure that all of the employees understand the risks in their particular areas. There is also, again, in terms of communication, ensuring that this is something that is all over the organization. What are the risks? This needs to be communicated at meetings with management, ensuring that the employees understand in their daily operations what are the risks that they will be facing and how to mitigate those risks. So that is how the culture then can be permeated throughout the organization.
I see. So basically, just they need very enhance whether in the corporate compliance itself. Okay. So we are moving on to the second question from Irfan Hakimi. So the question is that what are the benefits of embedding the right risk culture?
Firstly, I think the most important benefit is going to be that those risks are being identified. That's the very first step. Make sure that you can identify the risks that will impact on the organization, and that's both at operational and strategic level. Once that has been identified, the strategies that will need to be implemented to mitigate those risks will also be informing the board in terms of what decisions they need to make to manage the risks. So It's the identification of the risks and the ability then to put in place processes and strategies to mitigate and manage those risks. It also means that if organizations are very aware of the environment in which they operate and what the potential risks are, they are able to be more agile when there is an emerging risk that nobody's been aware of. But the processes are already in place for them to be able to manage those risks. In the case of the pandemic, nobody really foresaw that it was coming. Nobody could have known that that would have the impact that it did have. But if there was an existing risk culture in organizations where there were existing processes, they would have been better able to handle those and manage those risks in the organization. So it just makes the organization much more agile and also much more resilient.
Thank you. Hope that it's answered the question from Irfan Hakimi. So for the third questions from Ain Fatiha, the question is about how does GRC impact a company's daily operations and decision-making processes?
The daily operations and decisions. So when I looked at the different aspects of governance and risk and compliance in isolation, it very often happens that in organizations, especially in bigger organizations, there tends to be a siloed approach to all of these elements. So each department will deal with governance, risk, and compliance separately. So there is not a holistic view of what the issues are within the organization as a whole, because everybody's looking at these elements within their own operations. By integrating governance, risk, and compliance and making sure that it's actually permeating throughout the organization, it will make your daily operations much more effective. If you look at the 3 lines model, where you are actually looking at processes, procedures, and methods, and that is across the organization. We're looking at setting up common processes, identifying common risks, etc. So that will make your daily operations more effective. And the same would happen for decision making. If this information is, or the 3 elements are integrated, it means that the information that the board eventually gets will be at a level where they can make informed decisions. Instead of having information coming from different parts of the organization, and not all of that information will necessarily be communicated to the board in the right manner, it means that the board cannot make informed decisions. If you're integrating all of these elements, the board is fully aware of all of the impact of all of these elements, and they can make much more effective and informed decisions.
Okay, thank you. Before proceeding to the fourth questions, I just want to inform you that, Sarah, we have a few participants via YouTube platform. So basically, we just stream this connect to the platform, to the YouTube, sorry. Okay, so for the first questions from Nur Izati is about what are some practical strategies for overcoming resistance to change when integrating GRC principles into existing business practice?
Yeah, this is a very common issue, I think, in organizations. There is a tendency to resist change generally in organizations. People become very comfortable within their environment, and they don't want things to change. So very often you will find that employees will find out that there is new technology being introduced, or that there is artificial intelligence that's being introduced, and this becomes a threat to their jobs. So if they don't fully understand what their role would be going forward, or if they don't fully understand how the introduction of any changes will impact on their jobs, you will get resistance. So I think the clearest strategy here would be from the beginning to ensure that there is employee buy-in. And this means communicating any future changes that would be taking place in the organization very clearly to all of the employees, and ensuring that they understand what the impact would be of that change that you will be introducing, and how it will impact on their jobs and how it will make their jobs more efficient. So communication, ensuring that it also has the support of the board and the management, is really, I think, the best strategy to overcome resistance.
Thank you for answering the questions. Okay, and then the next questions from Patricia Uzma, which is about what role should senior leadership play in promoting and maintaining a strong GRC culture within the organization?
This would be quite an important role. And when you look at the integration of GRC in organizations, it's also important for an organization to be very clear in terms of what the roles and responsibilities are of the different levels. And when it comes to senior management, your C-suite executives, again, they're part of setting the tone at the top. So they need to fully understand, again, how the integration process is going to work, what impact it's going to have on the organization, what are the changes that would need to take place for this integration to happen, and making sure that the employees are involved in every step of this process, that they fully understand the process, that they understand how it's going to affect their daily operations, and that they understand that it needs to be a part of their daily operations. As I mentioned before, there is a tendency in organizations to really operate within their own department, and there is a lack of communication across the different parts of the organization. And this can mean that there is not much knowledge of what happens in the rest of the organization. So if you are going to integrate these processes, it's important that employees understand what the impact of that will be and how the process will take place. So senior management needs to ensure that the employees are taken with them, that they have the buy-in of the employees, that they communicate clearly to the employees on a basis where, or a level where they can understand how this is going to impact their daily operations.
Okay, thank you for answering the questions. Next, we have questions from Nurul Najiha. What strategies can be used to engage employees at all levels for the effective governance, risk, and compliance culture, GRC?
Sorry, what strategies?
What strategies can be used to engage the employees at all levels for the GRC?
There would be different cultures in different organizations, I would imagine, in terms of how they handle communication in the organization. But I would imagine that it would probably start with, at the operational level, that the employees are part of a meeting with the management team so that they can understand how the integration process is going to work, fully understand that. And that is a process that would probably need to be strengthened and monitored on a regular basis, because changes happen all the time in these processes. There are new technologies being introduced. What is an important part of this is also education and training of employees, so that they feel that they are competent in their jobs and competent to handle any of the new processes that are being put in place. So regular engagement in the form of meetings, in the form of training and development, but also in the form of reviews. I think reviews are very important to see how the implementation is progressing, and to identify if there are any areas where the employees may need to be supported.
So basically, it's just about you have to fully understand what you have to do, and you have to know, you have to bear in mind that there is always a changes happen all the time. So the regular engagement and training should be done regularly. Okay. So the next question is from Zunan Alif. The question is, what are in GRC principles throughout the organization?
Okay, we've talked about one of them, which would be the resistance of employees, would be one of the challenges, and again, ensuring that the management and the board fully engage with employees will go a long way towards getting their buy-in. Another challenge would be many of the organizations are turning towards technology and implementing technological platforms to assist with GRC. So this can result in a lack of skills, which would require training. It can also become a very costly exercise. In the long run, there will be cost savings and efficiencies, but initially in implementing a digital platform could become quite a challenge for organizations. And then I think there are sometimes cultural changes, overcoming the feeling from employees of being threatened by any changes that might happen. Some culture changes within the organization that may need to take place. As I mentioned before, departments tend to operate in isolation, and this might mean that there is more communication between departments, which could change the whole culture of the organization. I think those are some of the challenges that organizations would face in trying to integrate this. This is very often quite a bit of a paradigm shift for organizations, because previously they may have looked at these elements very much in isolation. They now need to reprioritize, relook at their strategies and how they're going to integrate GRC in the strategy as well. So that would also mean changes that would maybe need to happen within the governance structures and at the board level. They also may need to bring in different expertise, outsourced to consultants. So those are some of the challenges that they will probably face.
Yeah, I guess because now we are currently in basically mostly about the AI technologies and learning about these tools. So people should be adapt these changes, and they have to try fit in these situations and allow themselves to accept the changes. Okay, so I guess this is the last questions from Nur Hawaria. So the question is, how can organizations can create a culture where everyone feels responsible?
Oh, your last question is a tricky one. This is a bit of a tricky question, especially in bigger organizations. I think making sure that everyone feels that they are responsible for governance, risk, and compliance is quite a big ask. Very often people feel that they only need to focus on their job, on this part of the operational activities, and they're not really concerned with what happens in the rest of the organization. But again, I think here, making sure that the employees are very involved in the process of even looking at strategies, looking at processes and how improvements can happen in the organization, making them a part of that whole process of what is the direction in which the organization is coming. And just as an example, I sit on a board in South Africa, and when the management starts their strategic planning process, they start with consultation in little groups within the organization. And that is important because, firstly, employees need to understand what the organization is about. It's not just about knowing what the mission and vision is, but really what is the purpose of the organization? What is their role in achieving those objectives? And therefore, what is their responsibilities in terms of regulatory requirements that will impact on their role, risks that will impact on their role, as well as the governance aspects of that. So for the employees to fully understand what their role is in the organization and how that relates to the broader strategy and the integration process, I think that creates a culture where everybody is fully aware of what is the strategic direction and what their role is. Also, to understand the importance of their role within the organization. Every little bit that happens within the organization contributes to finally achieving the objectives of the organization. And when you're creating a culture where people feel that what they're doing is important and understand that what they're doing is important, will create that culture where they will also feel responsible for ensuring that they comply with the governance risk and regulatory requirements.
So basically, just when there is the priorities, the responsible should be there. And if you know your task, what should you do? And there is a responsible effort. But what I know is that when I learned that we have to create a culture in the organization with the sport of family oriented, the excitement to do their job very well and do their responsible. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. Yeah, Dr. Sharifah. Dr. Sharifah, if you have anything to say, you raise your hands.
Okay. Thank you, Zara, for answering the question. Just to ask one last question, Zara. Okay, because today we have younger generations with us who will be the future corporate secretaries. If you can share with them some of the future skill sets, if they want to be globals or the effective corporate secretaries in today's market.
You also ask difficult questions. Yeah. On the one hand, it's very difficult to define a future skill set because the governance landscape is constantly evolving. And we certainly don't know what's waiting around the next corner. But I think what is very important for corporate secretaries is that they must build into their future DNA the ability to adapt. And I think that is because of the evolution of governance. They must be able to be agile enough to adapt to any changes that's going to happen. They must ensure that they have the right skills and constantly make sure that those skills are updated. Things change overnight. We've seen the impact of technology and AI, of regulatory changes. So they cannot afford to not have a full understanding and knowledge and skill sets of what is happening currently. Be very aware, not only of what is happening within your organization, and that is an important skill set as well. Corporate secretaries need to have a full understanding of what's happening within their organization. But more importantly, is to always be scanning the external environment, because you need to be aware of, for example, geopolitical conflicts. You may think that that has nothing to do with you because it's very far away, but that has an impact on trade, and that's going to have an impact on your organization eventually. Climate change, climate action, if that isn't taken in your organization can face reputational damage. Looking at your supply chains, if there is not equity within your supply chain, that's going to affect your reputation as well. It goes as far as that. You have to constantly be aware. In some cases, boards will bring in experts called futurists. They are people who literally scan the future and look at what could possibly impact on the organization. So also be aware that you may not only be working with the skill sets that you have within your board, but that you may need to bring in external sources if the situation warrants that. So I think the main point I'm making is you need to be adaptable and agile in your role as a corporate secretary to deal with any future emerging risks and changes.
Okay, thank you, Zara. Pass to you, Alice.
Okay, thank you so much for answering all the questions given. I think we have come to the end for the webinar. So, yep, dear audience, before ending this webinar, all audiences are required to switch on your front camera for a photo sessions. I'll pass to the multi to take a photo.
All participants, please turn on your camera for our photography session. Please turn on your camera, guys.
Siti, I guess you can just to capture all.
All right, ready? 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay. Another one, guys. Smile. Freestyle, everybody. Freestyle. 1, 2, 3. All right, well done. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you, Siti. So, dear audience, lastly, students, audience are reminded to fill in the feedback form provided in the chat box. And with that, our program ends.